And today I'm going to talk to you about 9 common mistakes people make when creating service level objectives, and hopefully help you avoid some of these pitfalls. Let's get started. First, some housekeeping. We'll share the slides and the recording after the event to everyone who registered. If, as you have questions, feel free to chat or post them to the chat as we go along, and we'll do our best to answer them on the fly or pause to give you some answers as we go. I'm going to start with a quick intro to SLO basics, just to make sure everybody's level set. I suppose people joining this webinar probably have a pretty good basic idea about SLOs, but let's get on the same page, right? Then I'll go through our 9 common mistakes. At the end, I'll give you a quick overview of Nobl9's SLO platform, and then we'll pause at the end for some Q&A. So let's talk SLOs. The goal of SLOs is the goal of many businesses, which is to provide excellent customer service, but at the same time, to be as efficient as possible in our delivery of excellent customer service. You want to be good enough, but not too good at what you do. Typically for SLOs, it's going to be operating your IT systems or software systems. What do SLOs answer in the first place? They're an answer to this mismatch between parts of a software organization or any organization that runs software in production. What we have is, on the one side, we have technical teams measuring things like latency, traffic, error, saturation, signals about their applications. The business cares sometimes about those things, but more likely what they're measuring is customer retention, ROI. Are my customers satisfied? Where are those new features that are supposed to be coming down the pipe sometime soon? Strategic reliability shifts this to lead to greater success on the right side of this diagram by combining the two. SLOs are often compared to SLAs, service level agreements. These are similar concepts. SLOs are like an SLA without the legal and financial surveillance and penalties, if you will. But there are some other differences too. Traditionally, SLAs are focused on uptime, and if you parse the language carefully, they're written a certain way that's often on some kind of calendar boundary, like months, quarters, focused on measuring up times versus down times, or good times versus bad times. And then there's usually some penalty attached to an SLA, like maybe you get part or all of your software subscription cost back. They typically don't change unless you're renegotiating a contract every year or every couple of years. Service level objectives have some of the same concepts. We are measuring the service level, but it's typically not contractual. Service level objectives are often more flexible than SLAs and aim to measure user satisfaction as closely as we can. So we do focus on some of the same stuff: availability of systems, quality, responsiveness. Like I said, we typically don't tie to financial penalties. We try to use the data to drive decision-making, to take action in software and operations organizations. So let's get into the 9 common mistakes that we see as people are creating their first SLOs. Number 1, not creating enough air budget, which we also call too many 9s. One of the things about SLOs is that they work best in this Goldilocks zone, where they're not too warm and they're not too hot. That is, if my SLO is set too permissively, it can result in unhappy customers or team burnout because my system is either not reliable enough, or my team is saddled with technical debt and constantly firefighting in order to try to keep the customers happy without real investments in reliability. And that it's a very costly proposition for the business. On the opposite side, if you tune for too many nines, you end up with what we call gold-plated infrastructure. Often the way this manifests is a team, sometimes a product leader, but sometimes it's a development manager or an operations manager, or infrastructure manager of some kind, complaining that they can't get their features shipped fast enough because there are blockers in the way. If you set your SLOs for too many nines, you might achieve this. I think the most important thing to remember is that if you could get good measurement over your customer happiness and measure it as close to the customer as you can, who cares whether you're hitting 4 nines or 3 nines or 2.5 nines on any given metric? The most important thing is that you're hitting a number that keeps your customers happy. That is, when your customers try to use the system, they're generally able to use the system to the point where they're satisfied with it. It's not important to strive for some extremely high level of reliability. Often when people create their first SLOs, they sort of, they're guessing at a number. They pick some nines, and sometimes they're picking a little high. And we see picking high more often than picking low. Number 2, building SLOs in a vacuum. Sometimes it's tempting, especially if you have an initiative where you're trying to create some SLOs and you recognize it will help your team or maybe some adjacent teams, somewhere between development and operations, say, manage their systems better by creating some SLOs. The important piece here is you have to involve your product team, your business team, leadership. And part of the reason is that there are competing priorities here, and SLOs are intended to balance between these priorities exactly in this way. Operations, which is sometimes a separate team, sometimes embedded in the development team. And operations as a generic term might include the sysadmins and or infrastructure engineers, sometimes SRE, again, depending on what your organization looks like. But it's the folks that are on call and the folks that are trying to keep the stuff running and trying to fix it, right? If you're getting too many pages and you feel like you're being woken up at night, or your team is slowly burning out or quickly burning out due to on-call, that qualifies to me as an operational role. Developers have a slightly different priority. Obviously, they want production to stay up and for operations folks to not be paged, or for them to not escalate to the development team as well. But in addition, they're interested in paying down technical debt, making that case with the product team, who has almost an opposite drive to push more features faster, to release those new features so customers can use them. And then usually leadership has a view of trying to find some sort of benchmark to figure out all this money that we're pouring in, all the effort we're pouring in, or maybe you're even in a situation where you're reducing spend or cost cutting. You're typically making some kind of changes to your hosting environment, to your production, and leadership is probably interested in finding a way to measure that, that balances all these priorities and gets the job done, keeps the customer satisfied, gets the software built, gets it running, and keeps it running. Mistake number 3, creating SLOs that don't drive action. There's a lot of examples of what we nickname junk SLOs, but I'm just giving one that I see really commonly at the outset, which is to create one-size-fits-all SLOs on some kind of common metrics. And I'm gonna make fun of the golden signals. I rely on golden signals, okay? We all do. Everyone who runs anything relies on at least a portion, if not all, of these golden signals to do so. The anti-pattern here that I'm cautioning with SLOs is it's tempting to create your first set of SLOs just based on this data. Let's just start with the latency, a latency SLO, just to make sure that we're performing well, and an availability SLO that basically looks at, let's say, error rate, like status code on an HTTP service or similar. We might also monitor, is it getting traffic? And, can we make sure we're not hitting some saturation points? Like, for example, that your NIC is saturated, that your CPUs somewhere in your compute infrastructure are pegged. It's tempting, especially if you're on the infrastructure team or in an operations role, to start with these metrics. They can be relevant, but you need to go deeper. You need to look at what the user experience is, what the expectations are of the human users or consuming services, non-human machine users, or APIs, front ends you're supporting, systems that are dependent on your system, in order to find good SLOs. And just generating a bunch of stock starter SLOs based on golden signals is probably just going to confuse people more than it's really going to help. Number 4, creating SLOs and never tuning them. Service level objectives as a process is an iterative process. And one of the symptoms that we see in Nobl9, here's a little screenshot of a Nobl9 SLO. It's actually one of my own SLOs. It's in our so-called dog food system, where we're using Nobl9 to monitor Nobl9. You can see this SLO is it's red. It's been red for, what is this, a month. The burn rate is constantly elevated. It's constantly burning at, it looks like, around an average of maybe 10x of a sustainable rate to stay within its reliability target. It burned through its air budget a long time ago, and you can see that the performance of the SLI is constantly above this threshold. It looks like we have a 5,000 threshold for this metric. This is a latency SLO. So something is taking 5 seconds. It should take less than 5 seconds and is always taking more than 5 seconds. And this is probably just evidence that someone created this SLO. They said, it's probably 5 seconds. They threw it out there, and they're not really reviewing the thing. The same thing can happen if it's always green. If we just pick the threshold in the wrong place, or if we set the target in the wrong place, we could have an SLO that's just constant green dial tone, and it's completely useless. You want your SLOs to burn some error budget. Most SLOs should burn some error budget pretty much all the time. And ideally, you want them by the end of a SLO time measurement time window, you want them to burn through most of their budget. That's how you know that they're sort of set correctly. That's not universally true, but it's a really good guideline. So you want them to turn red when something goes down, and you want them to stay green when it doesn't go down. A great way to do this is to bake SLOs into your incident retros. You don't have to change the SLOs necessarily. I wouldn't create rigid rules around the thing. What I would add to your incident retro is a step to look at your SLOs, to examine across any incident that qualifies for a retro, to ask the question, did we have an SLO that alerted on this, or that should have alerted or could have alerted? And if your SLOs are giving you a good signal, great. It just confirms that you're doing it right. If your system was down and your SLOs didn't turn red, you might be missing an SLO. If your SLOs are turning red and alerting and burning through their budget, and your customers are not complaining and you're not having incidents, then you need to tune it the other way. And that's one of the beauty of SLOs, is that you have this target, which the nines, often nines, which is a knob you can turn to quiet an SLO, especially if you're not too fixated, like I said, on how many nines there are. It's a great way to adjust it. And depending on how your SLO is built, this is a threshold SLO where we have a specific metric that's intended to stay within certain inbounds range of, in this case, under 5,000 milliseconds. That's another thing that you can adjust. Maybe 5,000 is just, maybe the target is good, but 5,000 is, it looks like I have a 99% target here. 5,000 might just be too low of a threshold for this, and I should set it at maybe 6,000. Number 5, mistake. It's a mistake to not bake SLOs into your pipelines. Nowadays, you're probably using infrastructure as code, CI/CD as a technique. I recognize that there's a lot of sort of differing levels of maturity, even within an organization, even within one product or one team. There might be some services that are more automated or less automated. But I think we can all agree that one of the major changes that has happened that is driving and really enabling these new techniques like SLOs that allows us to manage our systems better and to manage more systems with less effort is automation. And your SLOs need to be in on that automation. The best way to do that really is to if you're doing infrastructure as code, do your SLOs as code. In addition to having an architecture inside of Nobl9 that does this, we open sourced a version of our SLO as code spec as open SLO. It's permissively licensed, and it's being used by other vendors and open source products, and other internal teams as well are using it as a sort of a schema, an open source schema definition for SLOs as code. If you're adopting one of the tools in the space that's using that, that's great. We also offer a Terraform provider, and here's just like an example of, like for our dog food system, how we arrange a separate repo with a specific directory structure, including some environments and some services or service areas within those environments. So one of the first things you should set up really is figure out exactly how you want your SLOs to flow through your environments. Make changing an SLO a pull request. Automate everything that follows it. Mistake number 6, fixing observability first. This we see a lot, and I think that it's kind of natural, especially if you recognize as an application developer or site reliability engineer, or anyone who's doing something that touches production, observability is really important. Okay, it's an important piece of the stack. However, SLOs observability isn't really prerequisite to SLOs. They kind of go in parallel with each other, kind of go hand in hand with each other. So I wouldn't think of your observability stack as, not ready. And here's I included this diagram. It's part of a series of diagrams that talk about different kind of SLOs that you can create, and the sort of instrumentation or telemetry data sources that you're most likely to find value in creating them on. And I'm talking about an application tier SLO here, which think of it as like a backend API, or it could be a backend for front end API, but maybe a typical REST API or web service, or some kind of HTTP API like gRPC API, what have you, but also any kind of RPC, right? Any kind of backend gateway sort of a thing. If you want to create meaningful SLOs on that, do you really need observability per se? In my experience, your first 2 places to go are going to be, sure, something in your application tier, APM, traces, or some kind of metrics from your application tier if you've got it. If you've got an APM in there, you're probably going to want to use that to set your application SLOs. At the same time, you might get a lot of signal out of what I'm calling platform metrics at your ingress or traffic point. And often that's not even inside your application. It could be something like, if you're running, let's say you're running on an Amazon platform, you could use CloudWatch to go after your load balancer, your ALB metrics. If you're on some other kind of an ingress, often there's some kind of a load balancer tier. It might be layer 7, might be lower level, right? We see a lot of significant infrastructures with hardware load balancing. The advantage there is that you can get blanket coverage probably of a lot of network boundaries where it's useful to measure an application SLO right off of those platform metrics without really having to do any deeper dig of instrumentation, without redoing your observability, basically. A lot of people forget that. You can also go after custom metrics and network monitoring, again, really outside of the application tier. And then finally, you can also include application logging. sometimes using logs as an observability source, or logs to metrics as a pathway, sometimes stated as an anti-pattern in some corners of the observability world. And I agree there can be some challenges with it. However, be opportunistic. Sometimes that's your best way of creating the SLO you need today. Following a specific code path or specific user journey, find an existing log line or add a log line. It might be your easiest way to quickly instrument something, depending on what your observability stack looks like. So I actually think getting SLOs in place, especially if you can get them in place with something that is cross-platform in terms of its metric sources, it can go after any variety of different things, can be really helpful. It can show you where you are really going to benefit from doing additional instrumentation because you lack visibility into it. And it can help you in general to, as you move your observability around, to have something consistent, specifically those SLOs, to gauge how it's working. I'm going to pause for a moment and take an answer from the chat. An anonymous attendee writes, I've wondered for quite some time, how would I best approach SLOs for example, a logging solution like the Elastic Stack in my environment? After all, it's about the customer satisfaction. So I'm not good if only Kibana is up all the time. I need to have logs shipped to Elasticsearch. Also, they need to be shipped on time. And how many more parts have a role here? How would I combine this? Or is this a wrong approach? I don't think it's a wrong approach. Okay, so in that metaphor, maybe I should switch diagrams, because I guess I would call that, I don't know that that's necessarily an application tier SLO. I might refer to it as an infrastructure SLO, because really your Elastic infrastructure is, in an application developer's view, might be part of their platform, is part of platform engineering, right? That said, to the people who run it, who deploy Elasticsearch, it is kind of like an application tier SLO. Going back to what I said before about the golden signals, yes, these things can be nuanced, right? You can't just measure, is Elastic up? You can't just measure, is there data flowing into it? You need probably some deeper metrics. We also run a data pipeline as part of Nobl9, and I have some recent experience with this in a couple of places. We have a data intake, which is very important because we're receiving telemetry data. It's probably the first of our jobs. If we have one job, it's to receive the telemetry data and calculate SLOs from it. But we also have similar pipelines that drive things like alerting, notifications out to, chat ops, paging systems, ticketing systems, et cetera. Sometimes webhooks to a CI/CD system to take some kind of action there. And those things also need to be up to date. So one of the things you might look at is step back from it and try to find metrics that will help you determine whether the thing is actually running, whether the thing is really running to your expectations, which it has to be up. Second, it probably needs to be receiving data, and it needs to be receiving enough data. So if I could do this, and I'll just use like a highway analogy. If I could look out my window at the highway, I don't live right by the highway. Let's say I look at a webcam overlooking the highway, and I can see the cars flowing on the highway. If there's no cars flowing on the highway, something is wrong. If there's a lot of cars on the highway and they're not moving, or they're not moving fast enough, something is wrong, right? And if there's queuing or back pressure or saturation points in your pipeline, you can monitor for those in addition to observability. And then finally, what you probably need to do is have some SLOs that are created on the data itself. So if you're expecting to have recent traffic flowing into your Elasticsearch cluster or clusters, you should be measuring that. You should be counting how many actual data points you normally have under normal operations that are within a certain recent time frame. Set up a query on that. If you can query it from your Elasticsearch on some intermittent basis, and this is exactly the way that Nobl9 operates with its metric systems, let's query once a minute and look at how many data points we have or what portion of data points we have for the recent time frame that really should have arrived if it's working as it should be working. If we can write an Elastic query to do that, and Elasticsearch has a very rich query language, of course we could, right? Make sure that it performs okay, that we're comfortable running it once a minute, then we're good to go, and we can set an SLO on that metric. Ultimately, you have to reduce it to a number, right? Let's go on to number 7. This mistake is called looking at SLOs only as observability. So SLOs are overlapping with observability. They're not observability, right? SLO is just going to tell me, it's like one gauge, or maybe 4 or 5 gauges, but all about the same metric. I have a burn rate, I have a reliability burn down, I have maybe the original SLI data, the metric I'm measuring as it comes in. I have a bunch of time series, but ultimately it's doing one thing. It's just measuring this one service. However, as we adopt SLOs, what we find is we end up making SLOs not just on, is my system up? In order to really build that bridge over to the other teams and the other stakeholders, we really need to look at the business metrics. Just some examples of business metrics here. You could create SLOs on a satisfaction metric, like a net promoter score, or happy face, sad face, thumbs up, thumbs down, support feedback loop. We have some folks among our customer base who want to measure against Twitter sentiment measurement. How they get the Twitter sentiment measurement doesn't matter to me, but if they have some sort of brand sentiment measurement in Twitter and they can put that in a data store that we can query, we can set an SLO on that. Another one is, this is really interesting one, maybe for the infrastructure folks. Nowadays, utilization of hardware, utilization of virtual hardware in the cloud equals cost, essentially. Cost is basically what a decade or two ago was a utilization metric or a capacity saturation metric. It's possible to set SLOs as cost targets. I could set one SLO on my cost per whatever your unit is measuring cost. For example, in Nobl9, what we do is we produce SLOs. So I could set a cost target for dollars per SLO unit per month. Dollars of Amazon infrastructure, where our main SaaS is hosted, per SLO unit per month. But the same thing applies to any cloud, Azure, GCP, any virtualized infrastructure, even if it's not in the cloud, right? You could set a utilization or cost metric. The thing is that those metrics are coming from a different place, right? Whether I'm talking about satisfaction, in this case, we're talking about like sales conversion, ITSM and capacity, ticketing systems, any kind of feedback you can get, marketing metrics, you can set SLOs on these things. And as SLO adoption ramps up, almost all companies will eventually turn to putting business metrics in their SLOs, because that's what they're really trying to measure against. I'm going to pause again just to check the chats for questions. We have a question from Michael Wells, who says, can user analytics be a useful SLI source for client SLOs? Absolutely. There's a couple different kinds of user analytics that come to mind. One of them is a real user monitoring. If you have some kind of client instrumentation, like RUM products in popular metrics and observability tools, you can also set. You can also get this kind of metric from, for example, Google Analytics, or other kind of like beacon or tracking bug-based softwares, Amplitude, Pendo, all of that stack, Mixpanel. it's worth building data integration to pull that data out so that you can make sure that basically you can set an SLO on it that can be some part of your SLO ratio. Is totally valid. I'll go on to mistake number 8. Fixing incident management first. This is another thing where we see where we'll talk to somebody who's working with SLOs, and they'll say, "Oh, my biggest problem is I need to go and fix my incident management before I do the SLOs." And again, this is understandable, right? Because especially given how great SLOs are in alerting, it's closely related to incident management. SLOs are such better alerting than anything I've used before. I wish I had it SLOs a long time ago. They're just less noisy, but also fewer false negatives. When an SLO alerts, if you've dialed in your SLO properly, it's a really, really good alert. And so a lot of people think of SLOs as measurement, reporting cycle, week by week, month by month, show the team how we're doing, show our management, our leadership, and the other teams that we're supporting how we're doing and how they're doing, and all try to row in the same direction and focus on the right stuff. And that's valid, but incident management is aided by both that sort of reporting and planning cadence being improved by SLOs, as well as the alerting being improved by SLOs. And these things are related and happen in parallel. And there's a virtuous cycle here, which is, if you're making an investment in improving incident management, you want to measure whether it's having the desired effect, right? You want to know, well, are my systems up more than they used to be? And if you can create an objective metric on that from a service level objective, then you get a good feedback loop. Are my changes I'm making in incident management and the investments I'm making there actually working? And then through your observation of your incident response and the retrospectives you do from your incident response, you can then tweak your SLOs and tune those to dial into what really does matter for the customer, for the user, the consumer consuming systems for your system. You can remeasure, find improvements, and then feedback back around to incident management. And I think, again, the important thing here is attempt to measure customer or user or consuming service satisfaction against expectations, and then also aim to measure each service's what I would call it's one job. Often in that one job, there might be several SLOs to cover it because you need to be up and performant, and the data's fresh enough, and there's maybe a couple of other things as well. But if you can define what it is that your users are expecting, you can dial that in, and it absolutely gives a lift to incident management. I would rather do SLOs, maybe even start them before you invest in incident management, because you'll be able to know where to focus and you'll be able to measure your results as you go. And in fact, we're tweaking some aspects of our incident management right now. Not major changes, but if we're making investments in incident management, we're also making investments in our architecture to try to take out some places that might be causing the biggest hiccups or the biggest outages. SLOs are, once you have them, they're indispensable for that, basically. Mistake number 9, trying to find the perfect metric. I mentioned earlier about being opportunistic. Sometimes it's tempting, once you recognize what the perfect metric would be, to go try to create that perfect metric. And typically what happens is, you may be iterating too quickly here. Typically what happens is that results in a deeper dig to go re-instrument the code, maybe add some instrumentation. If it's as simple as adding a custom metric here, adding a log line over there, something like that, it can be really small. But if it's big, you need to step back and look at it, because you may be able to find some useful signal there already. It might not be perfect, but it might be good enough to give you the signal, like I said, that turns red when you're down, stays green when you're not. Don't be too rigid, right? If you see that the metric you picked is not working, pivot around, look for some other things, learn from your mistakes. Don't get fixated on a single SLI. One of the things that we see in companies that have adopted SLIs is that have adopted SLOs is that they're running some SLOs, and they're the production SLOs, and then they're running a bunch of development SLOs, some of which are just new versions of their production SLOs that they're sort of trying out. It's like a beta SLO. And if it works better and gives them better signal than the existing production one, they'll replace it and constantly tune those SLOs to give you that signal because the environment changes. You know, it's analogous to, let's say, many of our systems are analogous to maybe a complicated intersection with a lot of traffic signals, a lot of traffic coming from different directions. And it can break for a couple of reasons. It can break because the traffic signals stop working. Maybe there's a power outage, you know, upstream dependency down. You can't have traffic signals without power. But it can also break because the traffic pattern changed, because there's some kind of sports event, you know, there's a game today, and the traffic pattern is totally different. The school is doing parent-teacher night, and this intersection happens to be close to the school. Next thing you know, your traffic has changed, your environment has changed, and you need to iterate on that. So these go hand in hand. Don't try to pick a perfect metric. Be flexible. Be willing to change and try stuff, and iterate. And that completes the 9 common mistakes. As a bonus, one of the mistakes you could make is choosing the wrong SLO platform. For example, you might be tempted to pick an SLO platform that only supports one data source out of all the data sources you have. If your view is application-centric, you might be tempted to pick your APM or centralized metrics platform, but you might be forgetting that your hosting platform also has metrics. They might be pre-existing, easy to work with, very accessible, pretty normalized across a lot of different services. So at the very least, I would say most environments that I see among our customers have some kind of APM or metrics in the application layer. And as I mentioned earlier, they're going to have some cloud thing, whether it's CloudWatch on Amazon or Google Cloud Monitor, Azure Monitor, etc. Statistics out of your OpenShift, or like I said, statistics out of your load balancers. Choosing only one data source is, it kind of paints you into a corner of having to shove all of the data you might want to measure, including even business metrics, all through that one data source, and it can be frustrating. Limiting your alerting options. Ideally with SLOs, because they cross over to business, you'd like to make them actionable to business people, your support team, your product team, and those stakeholders, at least, if not maybe the CFO or the finance team, again, depending on what it is you're setting goals on. And then also another anti-pattern here is a lot of platforms are now adding SLO features. The pitch for Nobl9 is that we're a dedicated platform that aims for very broad support, integration support for as many data sources as possible. And SLOs are our first-class feature. It's not an afterthought. It's not a little add-on because somebody asked us about SLOs. It's a pure play SLO tool that aims to completely solve the SLO problem in an elegant way. Quick overview of the platform. As I mentioned, we support a wide variety of sources. There's more than this. There's around 24 of them right now. SLIs in Nobl9 consist of queries from these data sources, either from a database query or an Elasticsearch query. Google BigQuery is a SQL query, PromQL and Prometheus, etc. Nurgle on New Relic, Datadog's API query language. We hit the API of any of the data sources completely configurable by the user, and we query those data sources intermittently to produce the source data for that SLI. Then within Nobl9, we manage the SLO, we calculate the error budget and the other time series. We have a screenshot here, I'll show you in a moment what that looks like. We provide SLO reporting, and in fact, if the canned reporting we have in the tool, it's sort of a decent reporting for a lot of use cases, but if you want to go deeper than that and you want to tie that to your business metrics, we also have data export out to delimited files and also Snowflake. So, and that the idea here is you might want to take your reliability data, the actual results you achieved, get that into your data lake, get it into your data warehouse to slice and dice it alongside your whatever it is you're measuring in your data warehouse that's an important business metric. Often it's revenue or conversions. Sometimes it's cost management. Sometimes it's other business service levels. And that export enables you to do that. And then we also support a wide variety of alert methods or notification methods. And you can see there, again, I think there's a couple things on here, including a very flexible webhook that can even safely store secrets in case you need to authenticate to something that can reach all the way down, like I was saying, into your CI/CD system or any variety of other things. There's some chat ops platforms in there like Slack, Discord. We also have Teams in there, and a lot of the other ones we can reach with our flexible webhook feature. You also see ticketing systems like Jira, also ServiceNow. I mean, they're not really limited to ticketing systems. If you're users of these tools, you know what I'm talking about. But integrating this in with the rest of the way you run your operations, your incident management, and your development, it becomes important. And then, of course, paging systems in case it's gotten dire and we really need to wake somebody up. Our early adopters in tech-forward companies find a lot of lift out of alerting. I have to say, I was surprised initially to see this because when people start shopping for SLOs, a lot of times they think of it as a reporting and planning tool, which is true. It is a great reporting and planning tool. But because it's such a better mousetrap for alerting, we see a lot of customers in the early stages of getting into Nobl9, maybe before they have enough historical data to show quarter over quarter results or something like that. They get a huge lift out of the alerting. Quieter, better, not necessarily entirely lower latency, because we gotta read all the data, we gotta process all the data, we gotta send some alert somewhere. But I'd rather get one alert 2 minutes in, that's the right alert, than what I used to get, which was 7 different alerts, and I'm not quite sure what they are. Some of them arrived earlier, some of them arrived later, and I try to make sense of them, right? What I really want to know is who's it down for, and ideally why. So what this essentially does, Nobl9's SLOs, is it turns the incoming metrics that we query into this common language for reliability goals that you can use in your technical teams and your stakeholders teams. Gives you a great way to easily manage SLOs. We have a easy sort of wizard-based walkthrough to create SLOs, so you can very easily create an SLO just in the web UI. But anything you do in the web UI is also reachable via code. There's a Kubernetes-inspired YAML syntax I also mentioned was open sourced as OpenSLO, as well as a Terraform provider. And we're looking to support other infrastructure as code just to integrate, to manage this alongside the rest of your services and infrastructure as best you can. We keep the SLIs and the SLO data for a really long time. And since we're only taking in a narrow stream of data, that allows us to store this longer than you would typically have retention in the source system. As I mentioned, we can alert on calculated error budgets. It's kind of like a magic bullet. We provide long-term reporting and ways to export for longer-term reporting, and there's no stress to maintain it. One of the folks we showed it to at one of the conferences late last year was, he said, wow, this is like a low-code tool for SREs. And that's really what it turns out like. You don't need to spend a lot of time, people's effort, salaries, also even hosting cost and the cost of running and maintaining, bug fixing, supporting, documenting, rolling out the tool. We put all of that into a SaaS product that can also be hosted in ways that are friendly at the enterprise level. And we have more data sources than any tool on the market. I'm just squinting at this to see if it's entirely up to date. I think it's already a little out of date because I don't see influx on there. There's a couple that we've added since this slide was cut. We have about 24 of them. We're adding new integrations all the time. Some of the stuff we're working on now are leaning a little more toward those business metrics, and also a feedback loop from some of those SaaS tools as well that would allow you to take in data about potentially other incidents, other aspects of systems management as well. And then alerting, you can see we're supporting a wide variety of alerts. Missing from here is that flexible webhook that can reach pretty much anything as long as it's reachable from the internet, from a set of static IPs. We can probably send an alert to it. And as I mentioned, we have SLOs as code via our slow cuddle. It's a Kubernetes inspired CLI binary that allows you to very quickly onboard into SLOs as code, or you could opt to use our Terraform provider, so that you can manage SLOs right alongside the rest of your growing heap of Terraform or YAML, and benefit from that automation, version control, everything. So let's pause for any other questions or other feedback you have. Shameless pitch. You can sign up for a 30-day trial of a small plan of Nobl9, or even an enterprise plan of Nobl9. You can go to this URL or just head to our homepage at Nobl9.com, and you can very easily sign up for a trial there. You can also reach us at hello@Nobl9.com if you'd like to get some outreach from our sales team or technical team as well. I would love for you all to complete our survey. You can get an Amazon gift card as a thank you for that, or we'll do a charity donation. Check out the link in the chat, and please give us some feedback. We got another question came in just now. What's the pricing model? I guess presumably of Nobl9, per user, data in, etc. We actually price on the number of SLOs you create. If you have a weird number of users, like you want to create one SLO and have 1,000 users, then we also have to put in some user pricing. But that's really not common. Most organizations are finding that the per SLO, or what we call SLO unit, which is any given threshold or collection of time series that creates an error budget, is our price point. To give you a hunch of how it works, if you look at our public pricing, you'll see that this plan we call Hydrogen, our lightest weight plan, that's the one that you'll sign up for by default if you do a trial, comes with, I believe, 25 SLOs. And in my experience, that typically would cover up to about 5 teams. So you can still think of it by user for typical systems. If you're doing something really weird or different, we should talk. But let's say you're running, some backends, some front ends, some databases, some infrastructure. You probably need per application. It might be, let's say, a typical monolith or macro service, maybe with one or two little sidecar services, not necessarily sidecars, but companion services that do some kind of queue processing or what have you. A typical small product like that would have maybe 5 SLOs as a hunch. And so you can think about this in terms of, okay, if I have a team of maybe 10 people maintaining the this particular application or product, you might need approximately 5 SLOs per team if you're typical. And so that hydrogen plan can get you up to an extended team, or maybe even up to 5 teams if the SLOs that you're picking are not, you're not overly canvassing your entire application with SLOs, obviously depending on the needs of your business. I want to just back up to my slide because it was kind of related to some of those questions about instrumentation, and also related to why we have so many data sources, right? When you think about it, in a typical application, you have platform metrics on your infrastructure, things like your machines, your virtual machines, what have you, your compute infrastructure, clusters, and other coordinating services like Kubernetes or a Zookeeper, etc. Networks, especially network boundaries between private networks and public networks, etc. Storage. Set an SLO on your file system. Set an SLO on your SAN or your NAS. Set an SLO on your S3 bucket or GCS bucket. We've designed Nobl9 in a way that we can have very broad support for metrics. Someday I'm hoping to have SMF record input or additional tools so we can more easily set SLOs on mainframes. But even today, if you can get the data into a supported metric system, we can set an SLO on it, and databases. And that's not even, none of that's really observability, right? You may have some observability over your clusters, your databases, etc., but it's also possible to get this straight from your platform. In the application tier, as I mentioned, popular APM tools, tracing tools, metrics, and application logging. In this ingress tier, again, you're going for platform metrics and platform engineering type metrics. In the client tier, RUM, traces in the client tier as well. In both the application tier and the client tier, we're seeing a big adoption of OpenTelemetry right now. Probably about half of our customers and prospects that we talk to have already implemented OpenTelemetry in some portion of their systems, not all of their systems. And that's allowing them to diversify a lot of the tools that they use for this sort of stuff in both the client tier and the application tier. And then sometimes you go for things that are wholly outside your system. There may be a transaction platform such as, let's say, insurance claims processing or payment, card payments, or any kind of bank payments or any kind of clearinghouse, whether it's in banking or insurance or anything else. You may be able to get metrics out of those that are actually not in your system, but that you can set SLOs on. That's one typical place. Or from an external system, you can run synthetics. You can set an SLO exclusive to the synthetics data. So you're not really using live traffic. You're getting something that's a lot more predictable and also a lot more consistent, but you can still set an SLO on that and set a target for how well your synthetic should work, how often it should fail, and how quickly it should operate, etc. So anyway, I think this is worth revisiting. It might seem like it's kind of a complicated diagram, but in practice, what it means is you could create an SLO today on pretty much anything you want, that's like the underlying design goal here is let's make it easy to create the SLO that you need today quickly, right after the retro. Let's put something in place. Might not be perfect, but we can get it in place because we have broad support for all these different metric systems, and there's certainly something we could measure. Something we could put a watch on. I like to use a metaphor of, it used to be that we could watch everything. I started my career as a DBA, and I think I was bragging at one point that I was running 60 some databases. Nowadays, 60 databases is nothing. We run thousands of services. I could run them all from my phone if I could get the YubiKey plugged into the phone properly, right? Because of the automation that we enjoy. But the difference is we can no longer hear the hum of those engines. And so instead, what we need to do is really externalize that through SLOs as code. Work with the application development team to figure out what it means for a given system to be operating in bounds versus out of bounds. Code that, actually codify it into code. And they say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If I have so many wheels that I can't hear them all anymore, what I need to do is I need to put a microphone on each wheel, on each axle. And that's what SLOs provide. The standard way of setting inbounds behavior really flexibly across your systems that immediately improves that alerting, immediately gives you a way to report, brings everyone together with shared data. I can't say enough. Anyway, I think we're at the top of the hour and we're probably about ready to wrap. Does anyone have any additional questions in the last couple of minutes here? I think we just got another one. Javier X asks us, do you monitor trends as well as thresholds? We do have in the platform, we do have something related to trends. Incidentally, these are my live SLOs. One of them I've been watching because we had a bit of an issue with it over the last couple of days. There is something that is kind of analogous to trending in our alert definitions. And I'll just check all three types of options for alert definitions so you can understand what I'm talking about there, Javier, or anyone else who's interested. One of them is alert me when the error budget would be exhausted. Tell me when I would exhaust it in 3 days and, it's trending that way for an hour, or, these are very adjustable. I can go all the way down to seconds. That's one kind of trend that we do. Mostly, we're not doing something that's really scientific, right? We're just looking at the direction of the graph and doing some simple linear regression. This one's not a trend. This is just alert me when maybe I'm like 90% burned, 90% exhausted by error budget, or I could do halfway exhausted or completely exhausted. Remind me, alert me when my error budget hits 0 and maybe I want to pause my CD and not cause more damage. So that one's not really a trend. And then this one is a trend again, the burn rate. Partly because in an SLO, burn rate it basically serves as a nice instantaneous health snapshot for that particular SLO. So for example, if I go back to this one that I mentioned was kind of unhealthy, you can see it's unhealthy because the service level indicator is going out of bounds. It's supposed to stay under that little pink line and it's trended up due to some issues we're having, right? And you can see down here the burn rate. The burn rate kind of flips up and down as the system behavior fluctuates. What the burn rate gives us is a way of saying, look, at this moment, in this minute, we were burning error budget at 33 times the sustainable rate. Sustainable rate being we would go from 100 down to exactly 99.0001, right? And then drift back up again over our 28-day rolling window. You can see over here. What this gives us is a measure for how bad is it right now? You're not burning at 1x or under 1x, you're burning at 33x your sustainable error budget rate. And this is kind of like you can know before the end of the month, before you run out of money, whether you're going to run out of money if your spend is, you know, too high. And the same is true for error budgets. Okay, good. So if there's no other questions, let's wrap up. Again, we will be sharing the slides and the recording. If anyone's got any questions specifically about the webinar, aspects of the webinar, you can also email Jenna Force at jforce@nobl9.com. Or as I mentioned, reach out to us, get in touch. Head over to our website, nobl9.com. Inbound email here if you'd like to talk to somebody and hear back from us, or just, you know, start a trial, and we'll watch quietly as you explore around the tool or help you out if you get stuck.